Thank you for that, Professor Blanchard. We already have quite a few questions that are coming in for you. I will strongly encourage everyone on here to please put your questions to Professor Blanchard in the Q&A section so we can get them to him. Professor Blanchard, also, if you could possibly, I know we've noticed this through your chat, through the conversation, if you could just stay close to your laptop, and that your hands might be coming in the way of the mic. That was pointed out a little bit from our audience as well. So if you can just be a little bit mindful of that. Let me get to our first question for you, Professor Blanchard. The question comes in, which is, how does, in your opinion, the current tendency towards stagflation affect your perspective on debt? And does it reduce the benefits of having or using fiscal space?
Well, first, I apologize for using my hands and putting them in front of my face because I tend to be...
oh, please don't apologize. This is the world of virtual.
Italian in that respect. I always use my hands, which is harder to do on Zoom and can be counterproductive, as you mentioned. So I do apologize for that. I don't like the word stagflation, which strikes me as the wrong word. I think what we're seeing is a very strong growth, leading to inflation pressure. That's not what I call stagflation. Stagflation for me is low growth and inflation. That's not at all what we're seeing. So I really don't like the word stagflation. But so how does what's happening fit into what I've said? So my view, going back 6 months or a year, was that as COVID was getting more under control, we don't quite know what happened, where we are on COVID, there was going to be a need to strengthen aggregate demand and try to recover as fast as possible. I thought that was kind of a priority at the beginning of this year. And many countries went along these lines, but one country just overdid it. And that's in the US, the Biden stimulus program, basically I thought was much too large. So it did what I wanted it to do, but it did it basically 3 times over. To give the basic numbers, there had already been a package at the end of the year before of 900 billion. And then it added to this 1.9 trillion. And in addition, there was a lot of pent-up saving. As we know, people basically had not spent much. And so if you added all this, you got a potential increase in demand of maybe 3 trillion, where the output gap, the size of what you could do before hitting supply constraints, was probably of the order of under 1 trillion. And I think what we're seeing is very much the result of this. When you basically unleash 3 trillion, right, not all of it is spent, but a lot of it is spent against a 1 trillion wall, then you get what we're seeing, which is that there's too much demand for some products. And in addition, potential output for the moment is lower than it was because of the supply chain disruptions and so on. So I think that's what we're seeing. Now, the difference between this and kind of a standard overheating is that the demand is hitting specific sectors. So instead of seeing a general increase in prices, we see very large increases in some prices. And people feel, so this is just relative prices adjusting. No, it's not. It's just that this general price push takes the form of some prices increasing a lot and others being more stable. So I think this was overdone. This has led to questions about how it ends. And it has led to, will the inflation continue? As you know, there's the whole discussion of whether it will continue, it's transitory or permanent. My view is that it may have more momentum than the optimistic people believe. I believe that one essential mechanism is that as these prices increase, wages are also going to increase because the labor market is tight. Workers are stronger in bargaining. They have lost purchasing power. They're going to want to have wage increases. When there are wage increases, then it goes into prices. and then it becomes much more permanent. Now, will there be very high inflation? No, because I think the Fed basically will react by increasing interest rates enough to avoid overheating for too long. But what I see is basically an increase in R-star, if you want, too much probably relative to what I think should have been done. So in a way, it is what I argued for, except much more than, I got much more than what I asked for. And but it indicates that there's fiscal space, but you should not overuse it. I think that's a case in which it was overused, and much less worried about Europe having the same problem, because the stimulus plans were much more modest. The output gap was much more negative to start, and we're seeing absolutely no pressure on wages yet. So I think that Europe is doing about the right thing, which is it is having fiscal programs, stimulus programs, but they're on the right size as opposed to the US.
I have another question for you at this point from the Fiscal Council of Iceland, from Mr. Torfason, and I apologize if I'm pronouncing that name wrong. There is no mention in the keynote of assets, the opposite side of the balance sheet, only debt. Could you comment on how your analysis will be affected if we separate public debt accumulated from deficit, from cost of operations, versus debt for public investments? He says that creates assets for future generations and current ones in return of that investment that can be very high in current low interest rate environments. So that is a question from the Fiscal Council of Iceland.
No, this is a very good point, and I would have talked more about it. And I have time. Clearly, there are contexts in which debt is good, even under R minus G positive, under normal circumstances. And basically, when you use that to invest in the future, then that's good, and it can be largely financed by debt. That's very relevant in this case, because we indeed have many needs in the form of public investment. I mean, green investment being at the top, but there are many other things. Education, for example, in many countries needs more spending, and investment in human capital is investment. So indeed, if you can combine, if you have, first you should, well, let me answer it this way. You should always do the public investment which is justified. So to be nerdy about this, if you look at a project and the risk-adjusted social rate of return exceeds the rate at which you can borrow, you should do it. And at this stage, my sense is that there's a whole lot of projects which meet this threshold, be it new drugs for future pandemics, be it green, be it various ways of reducing inequality. I think all this should be done, no matter what. Then the issue is, how should it be financed? Well, to the extent that it's going to have fiscal financial returns in the future, then you can finance it by debt the same way a firm would. But many of these projects make life better, but do not necessarily have fiscal returns. Some of what we do with green investment may not lead to a higher growth rate. It may lead to a better growth rate, but not necessarily a higher one, and may not bring revenues. So in this case, you have to be more careful about whether you finance it by debt. So this is the traditional discussion. In the context in which private demand otherwise is weak, then you actually can do two things in one step, which is you can do some of this public investment, which you should do anyway, and it's going to help total demand, it's going to help aggregate demand, and so it's going to be useful in the short run by increasing demand and getting output closer to potential, and it's going to do good things in the long run by making the world a better place. So I think that, again, it's important to distinguish between the projects. How much infrastructure investment should we make? That should be done if the projects make sense in the way I've described. And then how we finance them implies considerations of, will they yield revenues? Is it useful at this stage to spend more and sustain aggregate demand? And So the financing decision is where we have to take all these elements into consideration.
Professor Blanchard, I think very significantly, I think that brings up a question from Madeline at Eurostat. It kind of ties into what you were just saying. And she's asking, what do you recommend for stimulus packages in the EU and its member state? And how do you actually assess in terms of the volume of packages that are in place right now? What is your opinion?
So I think there are, three packages. So the ones we had during COVID, and there the priority was protection of firms, protection of people. That was done. The second one was the recovery programs, which came in various places, which were both about recovery and the medium run. And so, for example, I think of the Relance program of last year in France as being basically aimed at increasing demand. So having the same purpose as the Biden stimulus program, but on a much more reasonable scale. Then there are now new programs, and I think next generation, which was presented as the recovery program, is largely a program for the medium term. It's not going to help the recovery now, basically over delays. But I think we're now at that stage at which we have to think of beyond the recovery, making growth better. And this is a new program. So it's France 2030 yesterday announced by Macron. It's a lot of a next generation program. I think these are very good programs. And I think we are in a situation in which we can, if needed, finance them largely by debt, and it's worth it. Again, we have to be careful about the content, but what I've seen of the next generation program and what the countries have done with it sounds very good in general. I think that the program which was announced by the French president yesterday is fundamentally quite good. I think this is the time to have these programs in place and do some of the things we should have done a while back.
Well, I think that's also bringing up yet another question that's come in, and I'll refer you back to something I heard Pascal Donoghue say yesterday at the IMF, saying that reopening of public consultations on fiscal rules by the European Commission, he thinks it's great timing. The question that's come in that's asking you your opinion about the proposal to introduce a fiscal council to assess fiscal sustainability. Do you suggest this should replace existing rules and fiscal governance in the EU? And if so, what about the problem that the analysis of a technocratic body may have very little political influence?
So, as some of the people on the call may know, I have written a paper in which I've argued that's how it should be done. I've argued that it's such a complex exercise that the notion that you can reduce it to a simple rule is misguided, and that trying to approximate it by a complicated rule is what the EU has done, and the result is infinite complication, but the rule is still not very good. And so I've argued that basically it has to be done the way I described in one of the slides, which is basically by simulations, taking into account, as much information as possible. It should be done each year for each country, and it should take the form, if it's a technocratic form, clearly, of a distribution of debt, distribution of deficits at the end of the horizon, and then a discussion along these lines. From an economist point of view, I think that's the way to do it. How it could be done, I think that it's an exercise which could be done by national fiscal councils in combination with a commission, and it should basically be a starting point in which there's a discussion with the country of whether the conclusions of a commission are reasonable or not. Now, I've been told many times this is too fuzzy, this is not going to work. And again, the complexity of the operation is such that trying to reduce it to a set of strict rules is probably not the best idea from an economic point of view, but maybe politically it's needed. If we go back and we have rules, and there's a whole set of proposals on the table. Some of them are basically we keep the same rules, but we change the parameters, so you don't have to reduce the debt by 1/20th of the difference between actual debt and 60%, we relax that, we relax this. It's not ideal. It's better than what there was. If you were to design a rule which was better, approximated better what you want to achieve, what the equation which I showed says is basically as long as you can have a primary balance which covers interest payments defined as R minus G times D. Okay. If basically you have a primary balance which covers that, maybe not each year, but over time, that's the way to go on. To put it in simpler terms, rather than focusing on debt, we have to focus on debt service. But when we focus on debt service, the caveat is that we should not focus on debt service this year, which is very low, but we should focus on the distribution of debt service. You know, what do we do if interest rates increase by 100 basis points next year? So I think a rule should probably give more weight to debt service than to debt than the existing rules. But you know, this is going to be the debate for the next months or maybe even years.
We have a comment that has come in from a Japanese perspective from a Mr. Yoshino, who is the chairperson of the Japanese Bond Investors Meeting and emeritus professor at Keio University in Japan. And please give me your opinion on what he says. Japanese stability of government bond market relies on huge demand for government bonds, thanks to the accumulated domestic savings and current demand by the Central Bank of Japan. Comparisons between R&G come from the government budget constraints and does not include demand for government bonds. What do you make of that perspective, sir?
I did not understand the last part.
So he is asking, it's more of a comment than a question, where he's asking, saying that comparisons between R&G are coming from a perspective of government budget constraints and doesn't include the demand for government bonds themselves. Would you agree with that?
So I still don't understand, but the...
What do you make of the Japanese bond market situation overall and how it differs from the US and the EU?
What I see is that, you know, the level of debt is extremely high and the rate on 10-year bonds is negative. Now, why is it negative? Well, partly because the central bank, you know, has bought a lot of bonds. But I see what the central bank has done as trying to relax a bit the effective lower bound. Basically, they cannot do anything with the policy rate, so they intervene along the yield curve, and they have tried to decrease all the rates, and they have committed to very low rates even at long maturity. Now, if they committed to this, but the investors were worried, basically they would ask for a spread, and at this stage, you know, if they thought, okay, that's a commitment, but in effect, the Japanese state is bankrupt, and we know this, so we actually don't believe this, then I think we would see a spread, and the central bank would have a very hard time, short of buying all the bonds, maintaining negative rates. So my conclusion is, yes, the rates are very low because of the policy of the central bank, which basically this is an environment in which R star is very negative. The central bank is trying very hard to get close to R star through zero policy rate and QE. It is succeeding, and people at this stage, investors at this stage, are not worried about default. If they were, basically they would sell the remaining bonds, and they don't. Now, there are arguments about the fact that it's largely held outside of the BOJ by households, and they are very reluctant. But my sense is if the households decided that there was a chance that there was going to be default on the debt, they would not be holding these 10-year bonds at negative nominal rates.
Well, we have about 2 minutes left on our conversation with you, Professor Blanchard. So a final question to you, your views and your expectations. Where are they when it comes to a scenario with rising interest rates? Where do you see interest rates both in Europe and in the US going in the short term and the medium term? And what level of public debt do you think we need to reach before we start getting concerned?
So as I've said, my expectation for the rates is that they're going to remain low, except maybe for a bump in the US. So I don't have a scenario. Anything can happen, but I don't have a scenario I thought about which would justify very high rates suddenly. I think that before COVID, private demand was weak, and therefore we were running deficits, especially in Japan, in order to maintain demand and maintain, demand close to potential output. I think we may have to do it for a while longer. So we may have to run deficits for longer. At this stage, again, the debt dynamics are such that you can run primary deficits of some substantial magnitude, say 3%, without your debt ratios increasing. But I can see a scenario in which we need to have slightly larger deficits and that increases a bit more. Again, I think that's not ideal, but that's okay and feasible, and that we should not worry very much about that not decreasing anytime soon.
Professor Blanchard, thank you so very much for giving us your thoughts so early in the morning, taking all the questions from everyone from across the world who've joined us. I really appreciate your perspective and your time. So thank you so very much.